Today in Rockefeller College's election series, we're going to discuss US elections. We're joined by two of our very own American politics experts today, Cammie Bolin and Justin Zimmerman. So let me say a thing or two about both of our speakers. Dr. Bolin is an assistant professor of political science here at Rockefeller College. Her research focuses on political identity, political representation, and political participation. She's written on the intersection between religion and politics, as well as female candidates and their self-presentation when running for office, what it means to run for office as a woman. Dr. Zimmerman is also an assistant professor here at Rockefeller College. His research centers around Black and urban politics, also emphasizes political participation. He has written on how Black Chicagoans advocate for themselves with local institutions, politicians, and police who they often don't trust. So before I hand it away, let me just lay out some ground rules. So what's going to happen is Dr. Bolin and Dr. Zimmerman are going to speak for about 30 minutes. After that point, we'll transition over to Q&A. So we encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We ask that you only use the chat for questions and nothing else. Alternatively, we also recommend using the hand raising function, and I'll call on you if I see it. Anyway, that being said, let me pass it over to Dr. Bolin and Dr. Zimmerman.
Thanks, Connor. I think Justin will start out for us and we'll just go back and forth hitting a few parts and then we'll go to Q&A.
Oh yeah, I completely forgot. Yes, I am going first. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Connor, for that great introduction. And how I'll start is how I started like most of my intro courses, trying to gauge the freshmen on how they politically participate and vote. And I'll give like a rhetorical question because I'm expecting anybody to answer this. But it's like, so we're all geared up to vote, right? And I usually get like a but part of this is, really thinking through, particularly in our current state of politics, the excitement, fear, anger, resentment, cynicism that makes up American politics. And one of the things we talk about a lot in my intro class and in my Black politics class is, the importance or non-importance of voting, depending on who you ask. And one of the things I try to explain is that first, the idea that even the majority of the majority of American adults can vote is relatively new, right? Because for a long, long time, there were historic restrictions on voting, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, white primaries, property ownership requirements. You had to be male, you had to be age 21. So, for a very, very long time, there was a very limited number of people who could even exercise the smallest amount of political power in our country, voting. And then you get things like the 15th Amendment, which allows for Black men to vote, one of the Reconstruction era amendments, the 19th Amendment that allows white women to vote, the 26th Amendment that allows 18-year-olds to vote, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which expands the vote to all Black people, regardless of the region that they were in, particularly in the American South. So all of this matters. All of this gives power for people to be able to at least say, this is who I want to be my leader. This is who I want. These are the policies I want to get through the door from a state, local, or national level. But it's still not quite enough, right? Because why do people vote? And the reasons why people vote vary. Some people vote because they think the advantages outweigh the cost. Just basic, I think this policy really matters because I'm a homeowner and I want to make sure those whippersnappers over there can't get away with this, that, and the third. Or because, I want to make sure that my neighborhood can be a better place for my children, a better place for me. Other people just want favorable policies, similar to what I said in the first dash, but also favorable candidates for the things that they want to see in their communities, or just a pride of civic duty. Again, remember, the allowance of voting for most of American adults is relatively new. So there are a lot of marginalized people who believe that voting is very much a civic duty, a duty that honors the people who fought so hard and died for their right to vote. And I'm not just talking about soldiers, but I'm talking about civil rights activists. that had to go through quite a bit in order to give them that right. So they end up voting. But voting for who? And that's when we get into political parties in American politics. And one thing you'll notice, right, is that for as many sideshows as we have, what is the United States? It's a two-party system. Why is it a two-party system? Well, it's partly because we have this thing called, we have a pluralist system, which basically means that a candidate doesn't necessarily have to get the majority of the votes. They just have to get more than everybody else. It is a winner take all type of, it's a winner take all type of system rather than a proportional system that doles out seats according to who gets a percentage of the vote. We don't do that. It's just winner take all for the most part. So that really emphasizes the two-party system. But that really makes people mad, right? Because that limits what type of government we can have, what type of ideologies we can have, and that can get through the door and get policies through. It really limits how we can see democracies, particularly if you're in a marginalized group. But ultimately, it's ultimately considered one of the best systems for having democracy. Not the two-party system, but at least parties. Why are parties important? Well, they build coalitions, they mobilize voters, and most importantly, they're supposed to win. Right? That is the big thing. When you're a Democrat or Republican, the big thing when you're in those major parties is that we need to win. We need to build coalitions. We need to build a tent. That's our platform, but it's there to make sure we win. And John Aldrich, the political scientist, gives like a very good, concise understanding of what parties help to remedy with regards to problems with democracy. They help regulate the number of people seeking office. They help mobilize voters, and they help achieve and maintain majorities needed to pass legislation. So parties have a big, important role, even if our two-party system isn't necessarily ideal for everyone. But all of this is really subjective to an extent, because it's all about political socialization, the importance of voting, the importance of parties, the importance of two-party system. It all depends on kind of where you're from, who you were taught by, what is the history of your marginalized group or your group in this country, on how you're going to think about democracy in the United States. And when we say political socialization, we're talking about the people or institutions, media that really get you out that either mobilize you or, at least form your political identity. So I want you to think about, when you were really, really young and your mom and dad may have been watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, and you could hear them talking and going back and forth about political policies that they were thinking of. That's political socialization. Or when you went into the church and your pastor talked about, why or why not it was important to vote. And maybe you might have joined a program called Souls to the Polls and, went with your mother to go vote somewhere in the American South. That is political socialization. Or maybe it's not even about voting. Maybe it's about, being encouraged to to stay informed. The things that you see on like social media and Twitter, where you're like, oh, okay, well, I'll put a flag here, or I'll put a hashtag BLM standing or message there. All of that is political socialization and plays a role in how we think about American politics. And all of this is important for us moving forward and creating a democracy that's not only filled with informed citizens, but citizens that can rightfully challenge the systems that make up our current American government system and hopefully make it better. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Justin. I'll frame my few minutes of speech, I think, in a similar way in my campaigns and elections class that I'm teaching this fall and have taught in the past. We spend a lot of time talking about the rules that structure our system and their effects on the accessibility of political power and participation. And then we also talk about the broader realities that shape how we think about politics, a lot of this political socialization that Justin was just discussing. So I'll talk about the rules first, and then I'll get into the realities and how much partisanship matters and structures our participation today. So Justin, or I guess Dr. Zimmerman, is what I should be saying, he was discussing some of the broader rules that have extended the right to vote and progressed to bring more people into our political system. And those rules, at least in theory, are supposed to apply to all Americans, regardless of their state. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the differences we see on a state-by-state basis on accessibility to the polls, who can participate and how their participation works, what it looks like. So Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, I'll start out with this foundational document, and this is how I start out a lot of my classes as well. But it states that the times, places, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. And all that means is that states have the power to regulate elections. The responsibility of administering and managing the election process rests in the states. And this is typically something that the Secretary of State oversees. And because states can regulate these elections, we see a lot of variation on a state-by-state basis and also a regional basis on what exactly it looks like if someone in that state wants to vote. So different states have different rules guiding elections. The timing of state and local elections varies by state. Some states elect their governor on an off-cycle year. Others elect their governor when the president is up for office. And we can talk about some of the pros and cons of these different rules later and how it affects participation. Other things that differ is which elections are nonpartisan at the local level. So who do you elect? Do you elect the coroner? And if you elect the coroner, is that someone that is attached to a party ID or not? Other variation in rules affects what election day looks like. So can you register to vote the day of the election? How far out before the election can you register, or even do you have to register to vote? So North Dakota is the only state where you don't have to register. You just present an ID when you go to the polls. There are also rules and debates regarding voter ID laws. Do you have to show an ID when you go to vote? What ID counts? What does this look like? And rules regarding when you can vote. Can you vote early? If you vote early, is this in person or is it by mail? If it's absentee, do you have to have an excuse, and what excuses work for voting on a day other than election day? So I'll put in a couple of links in the chat. I imagine that a lot of this audience is, I hope, registered and ready to vote, but this is some links that you can check your registration and make sure that everything is set. So in New York State, you can register to vote online or in person, and you can do this before October 26th. There's also early voting, which is either in person or by mail. And on these links, you can check and see your polling places. And you don't need an ID when you go to vote on election day in New York. So in the Q&A, we're happy to discuss some of these rules and how they affect who has this accessibility, who can vote if they choose to, if they're eligible. I'll spend a few minutes now talking about another reality that matters in our political system. In my classes, and I think a lot of our political science classes, at least in the American context, partisanship is king or is queen. It's the factor that matters most in affecting whether or not we participate, and if we go to vote, for whom do we vote for? Who do we choose? So as Justin was saying earlier, a lot of Americans don't feel very satisfied with our two-party system. The rules that we have in place lead to having these two parties, but around a quarter of the public feels that neither party represents their interest very well. There's this desire for more options, even if our system doesn't easily allow for that. However, despite this stated preference for another option, most of us are sorted into one party or the other and identify typically pretty strongly either as a Democrat or a Republican. And something else, even if political knowledge in some measures is pretty low in the United States, If you ask people to name the number of the Supreme Court justices or who their senator is or how many people are in the House of Representatives, that's rather low, but Americans do a pretty good job of knowing what the two parties stand for. If you ask Americans a host of policy issues in general, a good deal of us can say Democrats tend to think this way, Republicans tend to think this way. And because of that, because our parties are growing farther apart, and because Americans recognize the divisions between the parties, it actually can be helpful for voters when they go to the polls. Voters, all of us are busy. And even if we aren't busy, it can be difficult to find information about all of our office holders or all of our candidates and what they stand for. And this is where partisanship can step in. So just by seeing that candidate A is a Democrat or candidate B is a Republican, we can get a pretty good sense of how they feel on a host of policy issues, and also how they feel about some of these grander visions of the United States. If we elect them, we can have a sense of what they will do when they're elected. So in that way, partisanship, even if we're frustrated with it, even if it would be good in many ways if our polarization was less strong, it can be helpful for voters. It can serve as a useful heuristic or shortcut where you can get a lot of information fast. And I think in that way, it's a reality that increasingly shapes how we behave when we choose or are able to be politically active. I can speak more to partisanship, talk about this all day, as I'm sure Justin can as well. We didn't quite make it to our 30 minutes, but I'll stop there for now, and we can, if Justin has more comments, or we can go ahead and go to the Q&A.
No, let's go.
Okay, well, I guess more time for questions, which is always good. So we actually have one question, a very timely one from Michael Tobman to get us started. He writes that it feels as if there's amnesia about the importance of compromise. The US, because of its vast size and regional differences, depends on this. Compromise is very much implied in our founding documents, and he asks, where is the question here exactly? Yes. Is this pivot away from compromise toward passion, temper, and polarization a function of changed civic education, reaction to the expanded franchise, social media, political parties, or something else? Why have we moved away from compromise?
I can start there. I think it goes to the discussion, or at least some of the statements I was just making about how partisanship is the primary predictor of how we vote now. So as our parties have become more polarized, so as they have grown farther apart ideologically, there used to be a number of policy issues where Democrats were conservative on some issues and liberal on the others, and the same thing with Republicans. But now the parties are ideologically sorted, where for the most part, especially among our political elite, Democrats are liberal on nearly all issues, and Republicans are conservative on nearly all issues. The rate at which they're dividing isn't the same. Republicans in Congress are getting more conservative faster than Democrats in Congress are getting more liberal, but there is this divide. So as they are growing distinct, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to compromise. There are added pressures within the party leadership to present a unified party brand, and that makes it difficult to cross the aisle and support someone of the other team. So that's at the elite level. But we also know that among the public, we are polarizing as well. Among the public, we're a little more mixed in our issue preferences. There's a little more diversity, more moderates in the public than in our elected officials, but we still see this division. There are all sorts of handy graphs that I use in my classes to show the drift from the middle to each of the extremes. And then the other aspect of this polarization is not just ideologically, but also socially and culturally. So partisanship is increasingly thought of as a social identity that we hold, just as we hold gender, or just as race and ethnicity, or any of these other parts that make us who we are. Partisanship is increasingly a social identity as well, and one that people feel really passionate about. Another characteristic of our polarization is that demographic groups are divided into the parties in a way that they weren't as much in the past. So by knowing the characteristics of someone, you have a good sense of which party they belong to. So all sorts of different aspects of who we are tied up and sorted and related to our partisanship. And this raises the stakes of each election. So if the other partisan team wins, it's not just that my political team loses, it's that my gender also loses, or this could have ramifications based on race or based on ethnicity or region. So much of us is aligned with our party, and it makes each election the stakes higher, and that makes compromise, I think, a lot more difficult.
And yeah, I mean, what Professor Bolin said is completely correct. And what I would say, particularly as someone that studies race and ethnicity, is that, quite frankly, we have to consider about what the changing makeup of the country is. The country does not look like what it looked like when, people were talking about grand compromise. Who has political power looks vastly different. That's why I started off talking about the Voting Rights Act, the 15th Amendment, the 19th and the 26th Amendment. A lot more people have a lot more say and a lot more voices than when we think about the good old days of compromise that weren't really the good old days. If you really think about it, I mean, there was a whole civil war, y'all. But but in general, what's happening is that with the parties is that the biggest realignment that we have between the Republicans and the Democratic Party happens after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Starts during the New Deal age, around that area where you see more Black folks becoming Democrats, but really revs up around Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Barry Goldwater and the Southern Strategy. You start seeing that polarization that grows and grows and grows. And what I want you all to pay attention to is not just that there's disagreement, but what is their disagreement about? What is being talked about when people talk, when you hear this, they can't compromise. What can't they compromise on, and why can't they compromise on it? When we talk about why can't we find immigration policy? Well, how are people talking about immigrants? Are they saying that they're grilling pets? So, and what are the racial animuses and issues that are coming along with that? And we need to think about, when we talk about gender, what are we fighting against? Because to an extent, there is some agreement on issues of abortion, but there's also a cultural conflict on what that's going to be and what it means for it to be to make America great again. What are we trying to move towards, and what do we want to move back to? And that's where a lot of conflict is coming from. And that is very, very demographic. That is very much based on people who are getting power that didn't typically have power in the United States. And that's where much of the polarization is coming from. Now, with that, and I talked about this yesterday with my class, I think, or maybe last week, social media does amp everything up, right? Because it's the place where you can find the most egregious memes. It's the place where you get the most simplistic messages, because it's a quick way to get information. That's good and bad, right? Because it takes away some of the context. And with that, you can fight back and forth without really truly hearing each other, which all plays a role in increasing, what we would call incivility. But all of that was already there before there was ever a Twitter, before there was ever a YouTube or TikTok or anything like that. There were already people fighting to keep me out of my alma mater, University of Alabama, when the governor stands in the schoolhouse door. What you're seeing is just an amplification a continuation of issues that have been going on for a long, long, long time. We're just more aware of them now. it's harder to isolate yourself from it, especially with social media and especially with 24-hour news.
All
I
right,
might have
thank
gone a
you.
little bit of a rant on that one, but yeah.
No, that was great, both of you. Thank you. Dr. Knobkop has a related question, so if you'd like to expand on anything you've said here, she asks, do either of you see a straightforward path out of our current state of hyperpolarization and partisan hostility? Are there actions that elites could take that would change things, and or is there a possibility of a grassroots movement for change?
I can start out. So I don't think there's a straightforward answer, at least not one that I know about. Sorry, unfortunately. I think that there are some factors that could change what the current parties look like. So one of these factors is just changing demographics in the United States. As the United States becomes more and more racially diverse, ethnically diverse, um, the Republican Party, at least as it currently stands, I think will have to consider, do they want to change some of these policy issues to bring in more people into their base. So right now, the Republican Party is very white. As America as a whole becomes less white, that's something that Republican leadership will have to figure out about. They tried to figure this out several years ago, and then Trump came and policies, they didn't follow the path that they laid out. So I think that just the changing demographics is one way that the makeups of the parties might adjust in the future. I think another way that the parties could change and potentially become less polarized is we see these party realignments often when there's a big crisis. So we saw the change with the New Deal coalition after the Great Depression. Um, if there is a new policy problem, a new crisis that the parties currently don't have these crystallized opinions about, then it could be something that divides the parties as they currently stand. So if we see these divisions, there could be shifts in what maybe the parties aren't immediately as polarized on this topic as people are trying to figure out what they think, and party leaders are trying to figure out how to address this issue. So if that's the case, maybe that leads to shifts in what the current parties look like, and potentially a little more compromise. So I think no straightforward answer, and hopefully it doesn't require a big crisis to lead us to this. But I think that's one way, given what we know about shifts in the past, that could lead to changes to our current environment.
What's interesting is that when you look at like people's ideologies, including people who are in marginalized groups, and I'll talk about Black Americans, about a third of Black Americans, like historically, have been conservative. Like, like, like they're fully, they're people who believe in things like they're pro-life. They believe in prayer in schools. They're very, very religious typically. And, they have different understandings of the LGBTQ community within that third of the community. But what comes from, the issues of why there's so many Black folks that are Democrats. And, there's a few people have tried to take on this role. Michael Dawson's talked about this, Ishmael White and Cheryl Lord have talked about this. And some of this is the social dynamics that, really push mobilization in Black communities. But also some of it, Paul Farmer talks about this the best, in my opinion. He just flat out says, look, the Democratic Party might not be the best party for Black people, but at least they're not outright antagonistic to them existing. And that is the issue that the Republicans have had for a very, very long time. Do they want to change that role? I don't know. I think that Trump is the crisis. And I think that there are so many people who are solidly right wing saying that they're willing to vote possibly willing to vote for Kamala Harris might be that spark that may allow for a little bit of compromise and maybe a closer to the I might be going too far with this, but whatever. Closer to closer agreement around people who are going to be reasonable about things like immigration, who are going to be reasonable about things like abortion rights, who are going to be reasonable about crime and things like that. You may have it there, but I'm not sure because there doesn't seem to be a consistent message on there doesn't seem to be a consistent message other than make America great again that people can hear from the conservative side of things. And from the liberal side of things, you have a whole coalition. The Democrats really are a big tent. You have people who are pretty damn conservative who are just Democrats because where else am I going to go? And people who honestly probably do need another party because of, they have a very specific set of rules that they want with regards to what they want the welfare state to look like, what they want foreign policy to look like. And those don't really mesh very well with what we have with either party. So that's all to say is that, this is actually very complicated and I don't see it being remedied anytime soon. But there is openings if people will be reasonable, but there's no reason for anybody to be reasonable right now. So, sorry.
Well, we have a question that's piggybacking off of that. Maybe there's some hope, probably not, but we'll ask. Renee wants to know if you see space for the emergence of a third party, and if so, where? On one of the extremes, the left or the right? Somewhere in the middle? No labels party? What do you think?
So I think there's certainly the demand for a third party. We see this in polling all the time. A lot of America is very frustrated with the options that they are presented with. A lot of America doesn't feel represented by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party for various reasons. This is particularly true among young Americans who are less likely to see a difference between the parties and certainly don't feel represented by either one. I think the difficulty is in the rules guarding our system now. I think we would have to see changes to how our elections function in order to make room for a consistent or powerful third party, certainly at the national level. So I think that the demand is there, that if people want this, but I don't think that the rules that we currently have in place, that Justin was mentioning earlier, Professor Zimmerman is mentioning earlier, can lead to at least widespread success of these third party candidates. Dr. Zimmerman?
Thank you, Professor Bolin, Dr. Bolin. Well, I'll be honest with you, no. Here's the problem, right? On top of, our pluralistic system, we also don't have serious third-party candidates. There's no infrastructure, there's no money, there's no name recognition. There's really not even a clear understanding of what the platform would be because they don't have infrastructure and they don't have money. And many of and particularly some of the candidates that like to do their annual 4-year, let's run for president for no reason. Like, they're not doing anything else. They're not running for mayor, which honestly, if you're gonna hit a third party and be successful, local elections is where you start because there is some success from that. Not a ton, but there's a little bit of success because, local elections are a little less partisan. Well, sometimes are a little less partisan, which allows for a little bit more openings for people who are in third parties. But in general, I don't see that. Like RFK was never going to be president. Cornel West, like him as a human being, was never going to be president. Neither is Jill Stein. And it's because we don't have a system set up for them. But also, you just don't have an infrastructure in those third parties yet. And as much as people talk about wanting to have a third party, they either end up lumping themselves in with the two-party systems eventually and how they think about a lot of the policies, or they end up just not really moving towards any work in order to mobilize voters and convince voters to vote in a third party. It's not enough that you just want to be in a third party, but again, it's about political socialization, right? So you got to get grandma You got to get uncle, you got to get your friends to do it too, and you have to be committed to it in a way that I just don't see that type of commitment from people who talk about third parties. I see it among Black women when they talk about Democrats and getting an entire red state to turn blue with Georgia. But until you have that type of mobilization, no, there's not going to be a third party, regardless of what the system looks like.
Okay, very fair. We have two questions on our queue now. Another one from Michael Tobman. So Michael asks, well, he says first that we haven't yet talked about money in campaigns and the general saturation of money in politics. He wants to know, beyond corporate capture of party, what's the role of money in impacting campaigns post Citizens United?
Yeah, so we've seen there's a lot more money in our campaigns now than there used to be. We see this certainly at the national level, but it's even going down to state races, so assembly races, mayor's races. In each of these levels of office, the amount of money has skyrocketed. I think in general, the literature on the effects of money, at least in electoral outcomes, is that as long as each candidate has pretty comparable amounts of money, it doesn't make much of a difference. Money makes a lot of difference when one candidate has a whole lot more of it than the other candidate. But you kind of have this, especially in these national elections, there's this race to one candidate is raising all this money, the other one has to too. To keep up. As far as the effects of money on policy, I think in general, Professor Zimmerman can speak to if he knows of other literature, but a lot of the literature suggests that the impact isn't as scary as it seems on the surface. I think that usually this money goes toward candidates that already support the policies that are behind the money. So you're more likely, or a shady organization is more likely to give a lot of money to someone who already thinks similarly to the way that they do. So I think that it doesn't have as much persuasive effect as we fear that it does. There is more evidence that it can buy access or meetings with politicians, but I think less persuasion and maybe just more of a way to get in the room to discuss. Those are my initial thoughts.
And my initial thoughts are, when we talk about who politically participates and who votes, you're always talking about education, you're always talking about class, right? So there's always a certain amount of money that matters, but similar to what Professor Bolin already said, we see in research that it doesn't matter quite as much as we think we do as far as political donations, especially with two major parties again. Like there's two major parties that have a lot of money in order to campaign for certain elected officials. It probably matters the most for people like, if you're thinking of, I don't know what you're thinking of, Michael Tobin, but if you're thinking of someone like Cori Bush, like the Squad, who isolated herself from her party and managed to get primaried. Those things I think could matter, but I also think we have to think about incumbency advantage as well, and think about how they're being perceived by their own people in their own communities, particularly like local elections and congressional elections. It's like, to an extent, these people know who these elected officials are because they're in their communities and how they're responding to them as well. So I don't want to say that money doesn't matter, because I'm sure I know it does, but at the same time, it's not enough just to have a lot of commercials saying that Kamala is like, I don't know. Have they done the birther movement with Kamala lately? Kamala Harris. Or was that just for Barack? Oh yeah, they did. Yeah, saying like Kamala's from like India or Jamaica or something. Like, like that has some effect. That has some money, but in general, I don't think it's quite that simple. And I often wonder if, for good and for bad, if the access to the internet, the access to social media kind of mitigates some of that too, because people can get information fairly cheaply and fairly quickly from multiple avenues with regards to politics. So it's not that I don't think money matters at all, But I do think we need to think about more about how people are getting their education, which goes a little bit beyond just whether or not they're seeing a particular commercial from, I don't know, APEC or somebody or some super PAC. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Like, you're not going to convince a bunch of Black women from Selma to vote for a Republican governor because you put a lot of money in there. There's other things and other things that are a lot more deeper than that are coming out. Political socialization again.
I think one way where money does matter is looking at who runs for office. So you have to have be in these networks where you know people who have a lot of money in order to make the case to the party infrastructure that I am someone who is a viable candidate and you should support me. Money is also something that when you talk to former candidates or people who were in office and retire, it's the biggest point of frustration for our elected officials. So much of their time is spent not on legislating, but making these phone calls and trying to get past donors to support them again and trying to bring in new money into the race. So I think that money is an initial barrier to entry into the political sphere. There are more and more training programs. On the left, we have Emerge America. Emily's List has been doing this work for a long time. There are beginning to be more of these organizations on the right that are giving tools for women or for people of color or people from non-traditional political backgrounds to teach them how to build these connections and how to ask people for money and how to do the work of being a politician. And I think that can help fill the gap, but you still have to be able to make the case to those already in power that I am someone who can do this, who needs endorsements, and who could benefit from the party's financial support as well.
All right, well, now we have an electoral college question, always a fun time. David Davies wants to know, is there any hope that the electoral college could be changed or reformed to reflect a more accurate reflection of the popular vote? For instance, have one elector per congressional district rather than the current allotment. So like the Nebraska-Maine model here.
Well, there's a lot of pressure for Nebraska and Maine, at least in this election cycle, to move away from their current model. So I think Republicans wanted to change Nebraska to where it was winner take all to benefit Trump, and then there's pressure among Democrats in Maine to change Maine's rules to benefit the Democrats. So I think neither of those efforts have been successful. I think they're running out of time. But that might be something we see in future elections. So the opposite of reforming the electoral college. So one movement that usually gets a lot of press every 4 years once people are frustrated about the electoral college is the National Popular Vote Compact. So this is a workaround of not needing a constitutional amendment to change this rule, but rather it's states agreeing that once there are enough states in this compact that represent the 270 electoral votes or more, each of these states that's participating agrees that their electors will be pledged to whoever wins the national popular vote rather than whoever wins the most votes in their state. So in this example, I don't actually know if New York is in this or not. I'll have to look that up. But in this example, if the Republican were to win the national popular vote, which isn't really how our system is set up right now, but then New York would pledge all of their electors to the Republican, even though the Democratic candidate likely won their state. So it's just a creative workaround that I think there, last time I taught about this, there were like 70% of the 270 votes you need or something of states who have pledged and joined in. So there's movement there, but we're not to the magic 270 elector vote just yet.
It's interesting, right? Because I was teaching this. And one thing that's interesting about the Electoral College is, well, it's not meant to be more democratic. It's meant to tamper popular Democrat sentiment, right? So that's where it becomes a kind of a question of what exactly or how's our country evolved since the founding. Because the point of the Electoral College was to make sure that the president wasn't so hampered by popular demand that they couldn't do the tough things that they need to do as president, whatever those may be. A lot of that's probably just like war stuff. So, so so it's like the way that this is come about isn't really meant to give the American people more of a voice. It is meant to tamper what that voice is. And do I see any movement to really change that? I mean, outside of what Professor Bolin has talking about, I mean, dude, I don't really hear any political elite really talk about this in any real way until they lose. So, so I don't know if there's much movement, especially if it will probably, maybe it won't need a constitutional amendment, because the very founding, the very way that we structured our government is to give American people some voice, but not to give them such a voice to where it can be detrimental to what the president needs to do. And that's actually more of a balancing act than we give it credit for. Like our representative democracy isn't meant for us to always get the final say as normal citizens. And we can talk about how we feel about that.
It is another area, though, where the public support is there, that well over a majority of Americans are frustrated with this system. And there are definitely partisan differences in this support, as we see with almost all public opinion. And after an election, support shifts. So if the Democrats win the popular vote but lose the electoral college, then Democrats are even more on board about changing this policy. But it is something that the public sees this as a flaw in our system. It's something that whenever I teach the intro course or campaigns and election, it's something that students are very frustrated with, that we learn about democracy and what a democracy is, and then you look at the electoral college and the candidate with the most votes doesn't always win. And that's something that I think is hard to get your head around, and is a straightforward way to criticize the strength of American democracy. So I think the public support is there, but you'll have to convince the elected officials in power.
Okay, well, we have another question here from Jonathan Doe. So Jonathan writes, one area in which the two parties have become more similar is trade policy. He continues on to mention Clinton's flip, going from calling the TPP the gold standard to eventually opposing it. There's a lot more here, but the question he ultimately asks is, are there areas other than trade policy where the two parties have moved closer to one another rather than in opposing directions?
Yeah, so I think typically the areas where we might see the political elites of both parties coming together are lower salience issues among the American public. So if it's a policy issue where the public is less informed or less interested, then it's easier, I think, for the political elites to not have this clearly defined difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Do you have anything to add to that? Trade policy and foreign affairs are not my specialty, but I think those are the sorts of areas where we might see more agreement than division.
Yeah, and you know, I would say that's about right. As far as like, I used to work for the State Department, and you know, and the one thing you have when you work for bureaucrats is that, you know, there wasn't this big, well, outside of the Trump presidency, there wasn't like with like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, there wasn't like this in how they discussed these administrations. There wasn't like these super extreme differences between them and what they were seeing with Democrats. So, you know, foreign policy, there's a little bit more agreement. Maybe that's changing too. but I mean, I think is when you, similar to what Professor Bolin was saying, when you get really, really deep into the policy weeds of what it takes to govern, and when you start going into trade, or you start going into you know, those type of numbers where they don't have to necessarily worry about what their constituents think because their constituents have no idea what they're talking about. Yeah, there's a little bit more agreement. Now, what's interesting though is that even if there is agreement, because I think there's a good, for all the rhetoric and all the bombast with it, I think there's actually a lot of agreement on immigration. So much so that they had a bill that Trump wouldn't sign. So, you know, even though there can be agreement, the show of disagreeing with the other political party, not giving them a win or not giving in to their demands is still there. It's a roundabout saying is that there's a complicated measure between I agree with you and that, you know, we could really make something of this, and also remaining a little bit steadfast and being kind of a barrier to the other party, particularly if people see the party as a more or less evil on both ends of it.
This is also something that I was actually talking about with students in it made me think of something that came up in my political behavior class yesterday. So we were talking about political parties and partisanship. And for part of class, I broke students into groups, and I had some of the groups look at the 2024 Republican Party platform, and some of the groups look at the 2024 Democratic Party platform. And one thing that kept coming up among the people looking at the Democratic Party platform is that a lot of the policies that Democrats were describing on topics such as immigration were more conservative than they were expecting. So I think that there are a few things at work there. One of the features is that the Democratic platform is 92 pages, and the Republican platform, I think, it's some bullet points. So there's a lot more room to be able to describe policies. But there were also seemed to be different audiences that the two platforms were trying to appeal to. So the Democratic Party, the first 3 chapters of their platform were about the economy. And there was so many mentions of the middle class, and a lot of Americans feel they're in the middle class, even if by real economic measures they are not. So Democrats were trying to appeal to this ideal middle class family swing voter that may be more conservative on some issues. Where the Republican Party platform, it was using the language of Trump over and over again, the sorts of phrases that Trump repeats and that I don't want to repeat in this recording. So I think that some of that goes back to this partisan asymmetry that I mentioned earlier, where Republican Party elites are becoming more conservative at a much faster rate than Democrats. And that can lead to some of these policies among Democrats that are more moderate or even more conservative on topics such as immigration, where among Republicans, you don't see that same desire or effort to appeal to a more moderate base.
Well, it looks like we'll have time for one final question here, and it's going to be from Renee again. She asks, you can talk a little bit more about rules versus reality. related to issues of accessibility in our upcoming election?
Yeah, so I think in general, the fewer restrictions or rules you have in place surrounding the act of voting, the easier it is if you are registered to show up and vote on election day, then that increases turnout. But I think there are differences when you start to look at specific policies. So, for example, with voter ID laws, they're discussed all the time. There are really strong opinions. I think the reason that states enact voter ID laws is to make it more difficult for uh, people of color or poorer people to vote. A lot of ill intentions behind these, but in actuality, I think there isn't much of an effect of that specific policy. So I think there are sometimes differences in the goals of putting these policies in place and then how effective or what the consequences are of enacting these changes. But in general, I think, and if you compare the United States to other countries that have even more accessible elections, then the more regulations that there are, it can dampen turnout. A lot of us, not probably people in this room who choose their lunches to learn about elections, but a lot of people voting is not their priority. So if there is a hindrance, if their usual polling place is closed or they see stories about standing in line for hours to vote, then all of that can dampen turnout in the next election.
And this has very real consequences. I showed a video to my class a couple of weeks ago of the Texas legislators trying to decide what voting laws they wanted to put into place. And one of the big issues were poll watchers and what poll watchers could convey to voters before they voted. So for disabled people who want to vote, you know, they may need to see things in a different language or they need to see it in a specific way. But the Texas laws were so draconian that if someone messed up or they talked about or if they did anything a little bit off about how they conveyed the messaging to the disabled voter or would-be voter, it could put the disabled person in prison and it could put in jail, at least have them legally, I would say legally in trouble. And it could put the poll watcher in trouble. So it really affected whether or not, first of all, disabled people would vote and how they would vote. And as Professor Bolin said, a lot of these voter suppression laws, including that one, are about keeping both people, brown folks and black folks from voting, but also people who are disabled, people who may have different ways of policy. By all accounts, Texas probably should be blue, but it has voting rights, it has voter ID laws. It makes it very, very hard for you to register. It kicks people off the voter rolls. And it's not the only state that does that. All of those things play into suppressing votes, and they're all a part of the law. And one of the sticky parts of this, and kind of sticky parts about how we founded this country, is this idea of federalism. We give states so much power to determine how they're going to conduct their own elections. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to cull that a little bit. But obviously, Shelby versus Holder ruined that monitoring aspect to make sure things were fair. So you have a lot of states where essentially, a place like Professor Bolin talked about that I didn't even know about in North Dakota, where all you got to do is kind of show up and smile and you can vote. And then you have other places where you have to cross a river, you got to go through the desert just to get an opportunity to wait 5 hours to vote. And it really does matter. I'll give you an example of a state I lived in for far too long, and where my parents are from, Alabama. Alabama put together a voter ID law. Fine, great, okay, whatever, a voter ID law. Guess what they did next? They closed all the DMVs in the Black Belt area. That's the rural areas that is predominantly Black and poor white folks. So that in order to get a driver's license or a state ID, you were probably going to have to drive at least a couple of hours to get to the nearest DMV. And as you all know, staying in the DMV is an all-day event already. So That's why these type of laws and issues become a problem, because they become profoundly undemocratic, both by the cost that it takes for you to be able to do what other people can do for almost no cost, and by essentially making it so that resources that you shouldn't have to spend in order to be able to vote, you end up having to spend anyway. And there's also the issue, and I know we're done, but there's also the issue of whether or not we're going to let people vote who have felonies or not. I worked on issues with my advisor when I was still at Northwestern that dealt with, really pushing for, people that have that have felonies to be able to vote, particularly in Florida, where they had already put in the law saying they could. But the crux of that law was that they would still have to pay poll taxes, in the sense of, having to pay court fees, having to pay courts and fines before they could vote. And even when people thought they had already paid all of those fees, they would be surprised to find out, no, you actually owe another $1,000 over here. And if they made any type of mistake, they could end up back in jail, back in prison. That's undemocratic. That's why the system matters and how we do that. And the rules matter so much of how our democracy works and how voting works. And it's a real problem in making sure that we're actually getting a reflective understanding of what the country wants, even past the Electoral College. Whether people can vote at all so that we can even argue over it matters.
A cheery note to end on. But everyone go vote, read those resources, and make sure you're ready.
I'm always the negative Nancy. I mean, go vote, guys. It's gonna work out, and it will. Things look different, guys. Everything doesn't look the same, even with complications and issues. It'll be all right, maybe.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Bolin and Dr. Zimmerman, for your time today. Thanks, everybody who participated in the chat as well. It's always very important for these events. You can join the Rockefeller College Election Series next time in person on Tuesday, October 1st, 4 p.m. in Masry School of Business, room 133. Don't worry, that's on an email. You don't have to remember that or anything. For a discussion called Your Voice Matters on Civic Engagement, hosted by a partnership of Albany's NAACP Civic Engagement Committee and UAlbany Votes. But thank you so much again, everybody, for attending today.